1463 late summer. The bells of Corel's royal chapel rang not for triumph, but for surrender. Princess Aveline of Corel was only 9 years old, a child with soft brown eyes, her gown heavy with ivory silk stitched in gold. The veil, so long it brushed the stone floor, was meant to crown her as a bride, yet beneath it she looked more like a ghost than a queen in waiting. Her cousin, Prince Baldric, stood at the altar, 19, broad-shouldered, his crimson and gold tunic glinting in the candlelight. To the court, he was the promise of bloodlines preserved. To her he was a stranger, his hand outstretched like a command. King Theobald, her father, towering and severe, watched from the throne placed just beyond the altar. His greying beard and jewel-studded robe caught the light, but his eyes were fixed only on his daughter, not as a child, not as a girl, but as an instrument. Queen Maela sat beside him, regal in emerald velvet, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her silence was colder than his command, and when Canon Elric lifted the cross to bless the union, his voice wavered, as though the words themselves faltered at the weight of what was being bound. The chapel glowed with candlelight. Courtiers leaned forward, their whispers hushed, their curiosity sharpened. They saw only a ceremony, a union of blood to protect a kingdom. They did not see the trembling hands beneath Aveline's veil. They did not hear the breath that caught in her throat as Baldric's fingers brushed her wrist. They did not feel how the veil blurred the world, making every face a shadow, every gaze a judgment. And when the vows were spoken, Aveline's voice barely rose above silence. Her father's gaze pressed on her like a weight. Her mother's stillness offered no shield. The crown's bargain had been struck, beauty masking horror, silk covering sacrifice. If this was the fate of a princess, what chance did ordinary women have? The veil slipped as Baldric leaned closer. It slid sideways, catching on the pearls in her hair, leaving her face half hidden, half exposed. To the courtiers it was a charming stumble, a child bride's shyness. But to Aveline it was the moment the veil betrayed her, revealing too much, too soon. She clutched the fabric with both hands, holding it close, as if the silk itself might shield her. Theobald shifted on his throne. The movement was small, but Aveline felt it, a reminder that her body was no longer her own. The candle sputtered as Elric spoke the final blessing. His voice echoed in the vaulted ceiling, strained against the silence of stone walls. Baldric's hand tightened on hers. She looked up, brown eyes meeting blue, and found no warmth there, only pride, only possession. Applause rose from the gathered nobles, their voices filling the chapel like waves striking stone. Some smiled, others exchanged glances, satisfied the crown had bound cousin to cousin, blood to blood. But Aveline did not hear their approval. She heard the rustle of her own gown. She felt the heaviness of gold thread digging into her shoulders. She saw the veil, once pure, now clouded with shadows. Her mother's face, pale, unmoved, remained fixed forward. No tears, no protest, only silence. Theobald leaned toward her as the ceremony closed. His whisper was meant for her alone, but the words cut deeper than any shout. Remember, child, silence is survival. The crown was placed upon Baldric's brow, but all eyes remained on Aveline, veiled, trembling, her future sealed in silence. The bells rang again. Their sound rolled through the palace, carrying across Corel. Yet within the chapel, each toll was a blow, stripping childhood, binding her to blood, marking her as wife. And when the veil fell fully across her face again, the world blurred into white. No one saw the tears hidden beneath. Only the veil remained, fragile silk thin as breath, yet heavy as iron. 1463 autumn. The palace corridors grew colder, though the walls were hung with velvet. Princess Aveline of Corel was no longer only her father's daughter. She was Baldric's wife now, a title spoken with pride in the great hall, but whispered with pity among the servants. At 9 years old, her gown dragged behind her like a burden she could not carry. The laughter of other children was far away. In its place, the scrape of her shoes against marble echoed back at her, reminding her with every step that she walked as a bride. Lady Ismene de Roquefort, her father's chosen guide, soon became her shadow. Ismene was 28, her sharp blue eyes always calculating, her wimple framing a face that never softened. She spoke gently, yet each word was a lesson in silence. She taught Aveline how to lower her gaze, how to smile without revealing thought, how to move through chambers as if she were part of the furniture. Beauty, Ismene murmured once, adjusting the girl's pearl necklace, is armour. Never forget, it is the shield that keeps questions away. But Aveline did not feel armoured. She felt hollow. Baldric, her cousin husband, rarely spoke to her except at table, where he boasted to others, laughing loudly, his golden hair catching torchlight. To him, she was proof of bloodlines preserved. To her, he was a shadow cast across her every waking hour. His presence filled corridors, his pride drowned silence, and when his hand rested on her shoulder in public, it was not affection, it was ownership. The days blurred, lessons in needlework, lessons in posture, lessons in listening without speaking. Aveline learned to hold her tongue so long that words began to rot unsaid. In mirrors, tall, polished, unforgiving, she saw herself reshaped, a child's face framed by jewels too heavy for her neck, wide brown eyes that looked back not with wonder, but with restraint. The mirror became her second prison. It showed her not as she was, but as they demanded she be. At night, in her chamber, Queen Merla sometimes visited. Draped in velvet, her expression unreadable, she offered no comfort. She would adjust the girl's sleeves, smooth her gown, then leave again without a word. Silence was passed from mother to daughter like inheritance. And so Aveline watched. She learned. Each banquet, each corridor walk, each whispered exchange became a lesson in power. She noticed which noble bowed deeper, which servant lingered too long, which word spoken at the wrong moment drew a frown from her father. Lady Ismene's hand hovered always at her back, guiding her toward the art of invisibility. To be seen, she whispered, is not to be known, and to be known is to be destroyed. The words settled in Aveline's chest like cold stone. In the mirror she practiced stillness. In the mirror she rehearsed silence. In the mirror she began to lose the sound of her own voice. The veil from her wedding was folded away, but its shadow remained. It lived in the way she lowered her head, in the way she swallowed words, in the way she learned to vanish even while surrounded by watching eyes. By 1464, the court no longer looked at her as a child. They saw only the polished image Lady Ismene had shaped, a bride too young to speak, but perfect enough to serve. And yet, in the mirror, when the chamber was empty, her brown eyes sometimes flickered with something else. Not rebellion, not yet. Something quieter, more dangerous. A question forming, though never spoken aloud. What would it mean if silence itself became her weapon? 1464, winter. The corridors of Corel Palace carried no laughter now. Princess Aveline was 11. Her frame was still fragile, her face still childlike, yet the court whispered of heirs. The golden tunic of Prince Baldric shone brighter than ever, but beside him she seemed like a shadow, small and trembling. To him, she was proof of blood secured. To her, he was the hand that turned her body into a vessel. The bed became her kingdom, not of comfort, but of chains unseen. Heavy drapes of velvet, once a sign of royal wealth, pressed down like prison walls. Physicians entered in silence, their ink-stained fingers measuring, their voices low, their eyes avoiding hers. Lady Miriam of Cleve, 16, stood often at the corner of the chamber, a servant, quiet, loyal. Yet her dark eyes never strayed from the sight of Avelin's suffering. She carried trays of broth, towels, basins of water, and though her lips never spoke rebellion, her gaze did. Avelin clutched the sheets as though they might hold her together. The pearl necklace at her throat felt less like adornment, more like a collar. She pressed her cheek into the embroidered pillow, trying to muffle what could not be spoken. And always, Baldric's voice lingered in the air, cruel laughter echoing from beyond the chamber, boasting of strength, of legacy, of the son that would soon be his. He never saw her tears. He never heard the silence between breaths. To him, her suffering was the cost of glory. Canon Elric, aged priest of Baymore, came once to bless her. His black robe brushed the stone floor as he lifted the cross. He looked into her eyes, saw the fear, the child within the bride, and faltered. His lips shaped the blessing, but his voice cracked, as though even scripture refused to bless such a bargain. The bed groaned beneath her small weight. Her fingers dug into its carved edges, the wood polished smooth by generations of queens before her, yet none so young, none so voiceless. The chamber reeked of herbs and smoke. Midwives whispered of remedies, yet nothing eased the ache that swelled within her, not just of body, but of betrayal. For she knew, though no words had been spoken, that her life was no longer hers. Nights stretched endless. She turned in bed, feeling the stir within her, the child she was too young to bear. Sometimes, in the flicker of candlelight, she thought she saw herself reflected in the polished brass of the basin. Her face looked thinner, eyes darker, lips pressed closed, as though the mirror itself was teaching her how to endure. By spring of 1465, the palace waited. Theobald demanded an heir. Baldric demanded triumph. Merla, silent still, adjusted gowns that no longer fit. And Avelin, draped across the bed, was left to learn that silence was not only survival, it was expectation. The bed became her battlefield, each contraction a blow, each breath a plea. The cries never left her throat, swallowed before they formed. Miriam held her, hand when the chamber doors were locked, when Baldric's laughter echoed in the halls, when physicians whispered of risk. The young servant's fingers were warm, steady, as though she carried words Avelin herself could never speak. At last, a cry pierced the chamber. Not hers, but the child's. Thin, shrill, alive. The court rejoiced. Baldric boasted. Theobald's gaze softened with victory. But Aveline did not rejoice. She lay against the pillows, her skin damp, her eyes fixed on the canopy above. The bed had delivered what they wanted, but it had taken everything from her. The sheets, once white, were folded away, never spoken of again. The child was lifted from her arms before she could count his breaths. And in the silence that followed, the bed loomed heavy, vast, eternal, the place of birth, the place of destruction. Her body had been weaponized for dynasty, but her spirit remained hidden, folded beneath silence, like the sheets tucked tight beneath her. And as the palace bells rang to announce an heir, Aveline closed her eyes and listened only to the emptiness within. 1466. The kingdom of Corel breathed uneasily. The great hall echoed with voices, but not all of them loyal. Whispers carried further than oaths. Rumours bloomed in corners, behind goblets, beneath the weight of chandeliers, and at the centre of it all sat Princess Aveline, 13 now, but still silent, still veiled in the restraint that had become her armour. Her cousin husband, Prince Baldric, laughed loudly at feasts, his voice booming across marble walls. Yet his laughter was brittle, cracking too easily into rage. Courtiers knew it. Servants whispered it. They had seen the bruises hidden by silks, the tremors in Aveline's hands when his gaze cut sharp across the table. King Theobald, her father, wore the crown heavier now. Once a symbol of unshakable power, it seemed to drag at his temples. He sat rigid, his beard streaked with more grey, his eyes narrowing at every hushed word that dared ripple through the court. He trusted fewer men, dismissed more advisers, and when he looked upon his daughter, pale in her rose-grey gown, his stare carried suspicion as much as authority. Lady Esmenda Roquefort, ever the watchful mentor, leaned close to Aveline in those moments. Her voice, low, precise, guided the girl not with comfort, but with strategy. "You need not speak," Ismen whispered once, her blue eyes glinting. "Observation is a blade sharper than any word. Let others betray themselves." And Aveline obeyed. She listened. She counted the pauses between her father's sentences. She noticed how Baldric's laughter faltered when a noble avoided his gaze. She saw the priest Canon Elric cross himself more often, as though shielding from sins he dared not name. The great hall became a stage of masks. Smiles stretched too wide. Compliments hid barbs. Every bow bent lower than truth allowed. Yet Aveline, the silent child they had dismissed, began to see the cracks. In the private chapel, where stained glass painted the floor with fractured light, she practiced stillness before the altar. The crown rested on its velvet cushion nearby, heavy, gold, glittering. It was meant to symbolize strength, yet when she looked at it she saw fragility, for beneath every jewel she could feel the weight of her father's fear. Theobald's paranoia grew. He demanded loyalty oaths twice over. He dismissed those who hesitated. His eyes searched the faces of courtiers for treachery, yet never found peace. And Aveline, the daughter he had bound for the kingdom's survival, became, in silence, its sharpest witness. Ismene taught her that silence could wound without drawing notice. A glance could cut deeper than accusation. A withheld smile could shatter pride. And Aveline, seated beside her mother's frozen stillness, learned that absence itself could speak louder than rage. Whispers swelled. Why does the princess not speak? Why does the heir stumble in his temper? Why does the king tighten his grip, yet tremble beneath it? The crown gleamed still in the hall, but each reflection of gold carried cracks unseen. And as Aveline watched her father, her husband, her court, she began to understand that silence, sharpened and held long enough, could become the very thing they feared most. The council chambers of Corel grew colder, though the hearth still burned. Princess Aveline was 15 now, taller, her features sharpening into the outline of a woman, yet her silence clung to her like a second veil. She moved through corridors draped in rose-grey silk, pearls braided into her hair, her brown eyes steady, unblinking. Courtiers who once overlooked her now found their words faltering when those eyes fixed upon them. Baldric, her cousin husband, could not bear it. His temper broke more often, his golden hair damp with sweat as he shouted across tables, slammed fists upon wood, demanded obedience from those already bowed. His crimson tunic marked him as heir, but his rage stripped him of dignity, and always, beside him, silent, still, sat Aveline. The silence unsettled him more than any insult. He laughed too loud at banquets, turned questions into boasts, But when her gaze lingered on him, his voice cracked. "Say something," he once hissed beneath his breath. She did not answer, and the silence clung like smoke until even his laughter died. King Theobald, now greyer, thinner beneath the weight of his crown, watched his daughter with unease. Once she'd been a pawn, a child he placed on the board of dynastic power. But now, her silence unsettled him too. He looked into her eyes and saw not innocence, not obedience, but patience. Patience sharpened into something he could not control. The corridors whispered of it. Nobles lowered their voices, fearful of being overheard. "The girl says nothing," one muttered, but her silence condemns more than words ever could. Another swore that when she turned her face to the mirror, her reflection seemed older, wiser, as if she carried secrets that outlived the walls around her. The mirror became her weapon. Each morning she stood before it, tall glass framed in gold leaf. It showed her not as she felt, but as the court saw her, a queen in waiting, expression unreadable, lips sealed, eyes heavy with unspoken truths. In that stillness she discovered power, for silence, stretched long enough, forced others to fill it with their own fears. Lady Ismene, sharp-eyed as ever, encouraged it. "Do nothing," she murmured. "Let them reveal themselves in the echo of your silence. Even kings tremble before questions unspoken." And so Evelyn waited. In council chambers, while Baldric raged, she sat motionless. In corridors, while courtiers whispered, she passed without a word. Even Queen Merla, statuesque in emerald velvet, grew restless beneath her daughter's gaze. "What do you see?" the queen once asked, her voice low, almost afraid. But Aveline gave no reply. Theobald's paranoia thickened. He dismissed advisors, accused allies, trusted only fewer still. Yet when he looked upon his daughter, her silence carved deeper than betrayal. He began to wonder, was she listening to him, or listening through him? Did her silence guard loyalty, or disguise rebellion? Baldric's violence grew erratic. He struck servants for lateness, stormed from council when contradicted, cursed openly before priests. His rage, once masked by charm, became spectacle, and beside him, silent still, sat Aveline, her presence a mirror reflecting his weakness. By 1468 the court no longer laughed when Baldric raged. Their eyes shifted instead toward the silent girl, now a woman whose patience unsettled every boast, every command. They began to fear what she might be waiting for. The mirror in her chamber reflected not only her face, but the tremor she left in others. What they feared most was not what she said, but what she might one day choose to reveal. And so silence itself became terror. Not in screams, not in blood, but in the unyielding stillness of a girl who had learned to turn her reflection into power. The throne room of Corel stood heavy with silence. Prince Baldric entered first, his crimson tunic dishevelled, his golden hair damp against his brow. Once the heir that courtiers applauded, he now walked with restless steps, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword. Yet the blade, symbol of strength, hung unused, a decoration for a prince unravelling. Rumours swirled like smoke, letters forged, whispers planted, secrets released in fragments no one could trace. One claimed Baldric had conspired with foreign envoys, another swore he plotted against his own father, King Theobald. The court did not know what to believe, but they believed something. And always, at the edge of the throne, sat Princess Aveline, 16 now, silent still. Her rose-grey gown trailed across the marble, her pearls gleaming faintly beneath torchlight. She spoke no word, yet every eye turned to her. For silence, in these halls, carried more weight than proclamations. Canon Elric of Baymore, the weary priest, stood among them. His cross trembled in his grasp. He had blessed Baldric once, believing him chosen heir. But now he saw the prince's rage unmasked, his temper spilling before courtiers, his pride breaking into fear. Elric's lips formed prayers too faint to hear. Theobald, crown pressed deep upon his temples, demanded answers. His voice cracked like stone splitting. What proof lies before us? What treachery hides in my own bloodline? His eyes darted from Baldric to Aveline, and back again. Baldric's fury grew desperate. Lies, he roared, sword drawn halfway from its sheath. Every word is a lie, planted to steal my birthright. The blade gleamed in torchlight, but his hand shook. Strength had become spectacle, and across from him, Aveline did nothing. No accusation, no denial, only silence. Her gaze lingered on her cousin husband, steady, unblinking as though her eyes alone were evidence. The court shifted uneasily. Each man, each woman wondered, what did she know? What had she seen? And why did she not speak? Ladious men, her voice a whisper at Aveline's shoulder, fed the silence with precision. Patience, she murmured. Let the crown believe what silence suggests. Theobald's paranoia twisted tighter. He questioned servants. He demanded oaths from lords. He struck the arm of his throne as if force could restore trust. Yet the more he raged, the more his courtiers turned toward the silent princess, the daughter whose stillness drew suspicion like a magnet. Baldric lunged forward in desperation. His sword clattered against marble, a weapon raised too soon, too loud, too empty. Gasps filled the chamber. Theobald's guard stepped in, and Aveline, untouched, remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her silence heavier than the steel at Baldric's feet. The betrayal was complete, though no word had been spoken. What destroyed Baldric was not the forged letters, not the whispered rumours, not even the crown's doubt. It was the silence, Aveline's silence, that painted him guilty. Canon Elric lowered his head. He knew the truth could not be unbound now. To resist the silence was to resist the current of fear already sweeping through Corel, and so he prayed, not for Baldric, but for the kingdom that devoured itself. Theobald declared judgment not with justice, but with exhaustion. His voice broke as he ordered his son stripped of command, his sword taken from him, his title suspended until proof of loyalty could be found. The sword, Baldric's symbol of strength, was lifted from his hand. Its gleam dulled, its weight gone. He fell to his knees, unarmed. And at the edge of the throne, Aveline's silence deepened, a shadow that would not lift. The courtiers bowed, the priest prayed, the king trembled, and still she said nothing. For betrayal, in Corel, had never been louder than silence. The great hall of Corel stood hollow, once filled with laughter, feasts, and the echo of Baldric's voice. Now it was a chamber of absence. The throne loomed still, its gilded lions snarling into emptiness. The crown remained upon its velvet cushion, but no one reached for it. The kingdom had learned. Crowns did not silence whispers. Princess Aveline, 17 now, entered draped in a veil that brushed the floor. Her rose-grey gown, threaded with pearls, seemed less a garment than an echo of every silence she'd worn before. The courtiers bent their heads, not from devotion, but from fear. They had once mocked her voicelessness. Now they trembled before it. Baldric was gone, his name erased from proclamations, his likeness removed from tapestries. The sword once his symbol rested rusted in the armoury, untouched. His rage had been his undoing, his silence, forced upon him by hers, his final defeat. King Theobald remained upon the throne, yet broken. His greying beard hung unkempt, His jewelled robe weighed heavier with each passing day. He ruled not with command, but with suspicion. Every oath sworn in his presence he doubted, every face around him he distrusted. And when his gaze fell upon his daughter, veiled and still, he no longer saw a pawn. He saw judgment. Queen Merla faded into corridors, her emerald gowns trailing behind her like forgotten banners. Once regal, once commanding, she became a shadow in her own palace, a mother erased by her own silence. Canon Elric, the priest, stood in the chapel longer than before. His prayers no longer sought blessing, but forgiveness. He saw in Avalyn not only survival, but accusation, a mirror reflecting his complicity. Each time she bowed her head beneath the veil, he crossed himself, whispering, "God forgive us all." Mirian of Cleve, once the servant girl, remained near Avalyn's side, not as guide, not as equal, but as witness. Her dark eyes carried memories of bedchambers heavy with pain, of sheets folded away, of cries swallowed by walls. She alone knew that the silence the court feared was born first in a child's chamber, where survival meant voiceless endurance. The veil became legend. They said it concealed her thoughts, her grief, her secrets. But those who dared look closer saw more. They saw how her stillness fractured conversations, how her silence unsettled alliances, how her patience corroded certainty. In abandoned chambers the bed still stood, heavy, carved, veiled in dust. No one spoke of what had been endured there, but the silence of the room pressed like stone upon those who entered. Avalyn passed it once, her step steady. Her hand brushed the doorframe, not lingering, not trembling, only acknowledging the place that had forged her weapon. The mirror in her chamber reflected not the girl she had been, but the force she had become. She no longer flinched at its image. She no longer questioned what it revealed. In her reflection, she found mastery, silence sharpened, transformed into control. The court whispered that she spoke through absence, that her veil carried messages more dangerous than proclamations. Some said her silence promised mercy, others swore it threatened ruin. None could agree, but all agreed on one truth. Silence had become the sharpest blade in Corel. By the spring of 1470, the kingdom no longer asked what Avalyn would say. They asked instead what her silence meant. And as she stood in the great hall, veiled, motionless, the courtiers bowed deeper, trembling not before her voice, but before the unyielding absence of it. Theobald's crown gleamed still, yet its weight seemed less than the silence seated at his side. And when the bells rang once more, tolling across Corel, they did not mark coronation, nor marriage, nor death. They marked the rise of something unspoken. A girl who had been bound by silence had turned silence into power. The veil concealed, the veil revealed, and in its folds the forgotten princess burned palaces, not with fire, but with secrets none could silence,